Okay, welcome to another Sunday night teaching. We're looking at Abraham chapter 16 today. So let's read it. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "Now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I will obtain children through her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your maid is in your power. Do with her what is good in your sight." So Sarai treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence. Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. He said, "Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from, and where are you going?" And she said, "I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai." Then the angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress, and submit yourself to her authority." Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, "I will greatly multiply your descendants, so that they will be too many to count." The angel of the Lord said to her further, "Behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael," which means God hears. "Because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. And he will live to the east of all his brothers." Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God who sees." El Roi is the Hebrew. For she said, "Have I even remained alive after seeing him?" Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi, which means the well of the living one who sees. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. All right, here we go. We're going to look at the example of Abram, the story of Israel, and the encounter with Christ. Except with the example of Abram, we're really looking today at the example of Abram, Sarai, and Hagar. And as we've seen the example of Abram, he's our example of a man of faith, and sometimes he's our example of a man with not so much faith. He's this example of the journey, the story of growing in faith over time. And this time, Abraham, Sarai, and Hagar are primarily at the beginning a story of not having very much faith, of having a lot of unbelief. And then Hagar kind of has a moment of faith in the second half. So it says, now Sarai, Abram's wife who had borne him no children, she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. Hagar probably came from the time when they were in Egypt and were given all these blessings while they were there. So Sarai said to Abram, "Now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I will attain children through her." Now, this sounds very weird. In the time, it was sometimes the thing that was done was that you would take a concubine or a maid and they would have the child for you, sort of a surrogate motherhood. But it wasn't done in a doctor's office. It was done in the bedroom. It was still violating God's plan for a man and wife. But this is what Sarah's suggesting. She's thinking maybe I can't have children. Maybe the heir you're supposed to have will have to come through Hagar, and at least I can give you Hagar. So Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. And Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan. But after he'd lived 10 years, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar the Egyptian maid and gave her to her husband as his wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived. So several things to say. First of all, this just reminds me so much of what I read last time, not realizing this was coming up, when Abram was talking to God, and God said, "You're going to have descendants," and Abram tried to sort of help God out. He said, "Well, I've got Eliezer. He's my heir. Maybe they should come through him." And God was like, "No, I meant what I said. I'm really going to give you descendants. I'll give them to you. It'll come from you." And so here, sort of the same thing happens on Sarai's part. She's like, "Well, maybe he didn't mean for me to bear the children because I'm not having any children. Maybe it should be that I'll just give Hagar to Abram." And so maybe she thought she was being helpful, but she was being helpful to try to do what God didn't seem to be doing, even though he'd promised it. And that's usually not a good plan. So one commentator pointed out that she had this moment that sometimes a wife will have, thinking maybe my husband would be better off with someone else. She was probably feeling, in that culture, she was probably feeling very inadequate, that she hadn't born children, and kind of insecure, and kind of like she wasn't being any good for him, especially since he'd had this big promise. And she was thinking, I'm probably pretty insecure about this. So she thought maybe this will solve the problem. It did not solve the problem. But Abram listened to her, and he shouldn't have. He should have said, I really appreciate it, but you're not better off with I'm not better off with someone else. You are the only one I'm loyal to. You're the only one I want to be intimate with, and you're the only one I'm going to have this child with. Let's just trust God together. But he didn't. He listened to his voice. And so after 10 years, this had been 10 years that they've been living here, he had sex with Hagar, and he should have said no. Notice that this is, again, in that day and age, it was kind of a surrogate motherhood thing. Wasn't primarily a sexual thing, but still, it was violating God's plan for marriage. It was a sexual thing still, and it was wrong for a lot of reasons. But one of the main reasons here is that it was wrong because it was a way that they, once again, were actually, this time they were yielding to the temptation to shortcut what God had promised and to try to obtain it themselves in a way that God would not have approved of. Okay, and there was a lot of fallout. Here was the mess that resulted. First of all, when she saw that she conceived, Hagar despised Sarai. She started to think, look, I really am the better one. Sarai, on the other hand, though, is now doubly hurt. Somebody said this was her worst fears come true, because before it might have been Abram's fault that they had no children. But now when she gives Hagar to Abram, now it's definitely her fault as far as she sees it. It's like, well, then it's clearly was something is wrong with me. And so when Hagar is despising her, dismissing her, and looking down on her, making light of her, it really feeds into her own fears, and she gets really angry about it. She goes back to Abram, says, Abram, this is your fault. You do something about this. May the Lord judge between you and me. And on the one hand, poor Abram's like probably thinking, wait, I did what you said, and now you're angry at me for doing it. But again, he probably should have not just done what she said. He probably just should have said, let's keep trusting the Lord together. And now he has to deal with this. And he doesn't even quite really deal with this. He could have gone back to Hagar and said, look, you need to treat my wife right. Just because I did this with you does not mean that you now somehow have displaced her. He needed to send a clear signal that he chose Sarai. And he did that, but he did that in kind of maybe not the most responsible way. He just said, look, she's in your power. Do whatever you want. And you can just do what is good in your sight. So Sarai responded, and out of her anger, she just started treating her really harshly, kind of abusing her in one form or another. And the result was that Hagar fled. Well, now they really don't have an heir because Hagar has left. But what a mess they've got. This was not a way to repair the relationship. It wasn't a way to make everything better. It turned out to be a way that made everything much messier than it ever had been, to make everything worse than it ever had been. And if this is where the chapter ended, it would be kind of a big failure. It was kind of a big failure. But God is a God of redemption, and he begins to turn things around immediately. So here we go. The angel of the Lord found Hagar by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. She didn't really have any place to go. She might have been heading back to Egypt. She found a spring where there was at least some water in the desert, and she stopped there. May not have had any plans to go any further, because who knows? And the angel of the Lord found her. So we're going to talk a lot about this encounter in the last part of tonight's teaching. But for now, I just want to point out two things. First of all, the angel of the Lord found her gives you a sense that God noticed and was looking for her, that he was paying attention to her. It reminds me of that when it said, well, we'll come back to that. But I just want you to notice that God noticed. Hagar was feeling very unnoticed and very unappreciated and very, very much on her own as a single mother with no means of support. And the angel of the Lord found her. Secondly, he says to her, return to your mistress, submit yourself to her authority. Now, I don't think the point here was that God is always saying that in every case somebody has to endorse, that he wasn't endorsing abusive environments. But in this particular case, this wasn't just a woman who was randomly abusive in Sarai. It was a sticky situation that had gotten bad quickly and not been resolved. It had started when Sarai made this foolish choice to give Hagar to her husband, Abram as a wife, and then was continued when Hagar became haughty and about it and despised Sarai, and then continued when Sarai treated her harshly. This is a situation that God wants to have resolved, and he sends her back into the relationship. But there's kind of an implied promise here that he is noticing and he's watching and he will protect her and he will protect Ishmael. And so I think she's partly willing to return because she knows she can trust God. And matter of fact, he goes on the next sentence, he gives you a great promise about Ishmael. So it's like he says, I know it's difficult, I know it's hard, but I want you to go back and submit to her again, and I'll work with this. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to talk about, is just point out once again, there's this long journey of faith in these chapters, where sometimes people do well, sometimes do poorly. Here they've done poorly, all three of them in a way. And God intervenes, steps in, and protects and blesses anyway, and restores things anyway. And once again, we see this happening. Okay, now let's talk about the story of Israel. And what kinds of things do we see about Israel as a nation from here? And once again, I'm really not just talking about Israel tonight, but about Israel and the Israelites and the Ishmaelites, because here we see how God dealt with Ishmael. And the Israelites, Isaac Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were the father of the Israelites, the chosen people. But Ishmael is the father of the Arab races. And a lot of different races came from him, but the Arabs are generally the Ishmaelites, the descendants of the Ishmaelites. So I want you to notice how he dealt with Ishmael. Moreover, it says, the angel of the Lord said to Hagar, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count. This is interesting because it's the same kind of promises he kept making to Abram. So he's saying, I'm going to do this with Ishmael also. As a matter of fact, it could have been that Abram at first, if he heard this, that he could have thought this was God saying, I am going to use Ishmael as your heir. Although that wasn't God's plan. Two chapters later, he says, I'm going to give you a son through Sarai. And Abram then says, are you sure you can't just take Ishmael? And he says, no, it's through Sarai. But anyway, for now, he says to her, he gives this child the same promise in one way that he gave to Abram. He says, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count. And then he gave her a prophecy about Ishmael. Behold, you're with child, and you will bear a son, and you will call his name Ishmael. Ishmael means God who hears, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. You were suffering under Sarai, you've left, you're suffering out here, and I heard. And so you're going to name your child God Hears, to remember that God has given heed to you, has paid attention to you. And then he says his life will be hard. He'll be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. He will know war and strife his whole life. And I think he's partly saying most of his history. And he will live to the east of all his brothers. So I just want to point out, God had a plan for Ishmael. Ishmael means God will hear. And like Israel, notice, the Arabs can trace their survival to the mercy of Jehovah in this moment. Israel knows they came from what God did, what Jehovah did through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Arabs know that who they are comes from this moment where God showed up and showed mercy to Hagar. And that's interesting. And I'd like to read you something that I read by the commentator David Guzik. He does an amazing job with this passage, and he had one long set of stuff I'm going to read to you that was especially helpful. So he says this. He says, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly. God not only implied a promise of protection, he gave a clear promise of staggering blessing. The unborn son of Hagar would be the father of uncountable descendants. So Guzik goes on to say, as the promise was fulfilled, Ishmael became the ancestor of the Arab people, just as his later half-brother Isaac would become the ancestor of the Jewish people. This makes the conflict between Arab and Jew even more tragic. They are brothers and share a common father in Abraham. You shall call his name Ishmael. Ishmael was given a great promise, not only the number of his descendants, but also that he was the first one in the Bible given his name before he was born. God had a plan for this boy and his descendants. God doesn't give a name if he doesn't have a plan. Many Christians today think they know God's plan for the descendants of Ishmael, the Arabic people. God wants to wipe them out because of their hatred of Jews and the persecution of Christians. This reaction is not rooted in the Bible, especially in this passage of Genesis 16. God's plan for the Arabs isn't just to wipe them out. Consider, he says, first, God could have allowed Hagar and her unborn child to die in the wilderness. He didn't allow it. He specifically intervened so that wouldn't happen. He could have allowed Hagar to live, but to disappear from the life and household of Abraham and Sarah. But he didn't allow that. One may argue that Ishmael's conception was because of sin and unbelief, but God could have erased him from the story, and God chose not to. This part of the story is God's doing, not man's doing. His conception may have been man's doing, but his protecting him and making him a very bountiful nation is God's doing. God specifically commanded Hagar to go back, to stay in the story. we can know that God's story for the Arabic people is not finished. So I just thought that was very interesting and something for us to think about. Now, it doesn't mean that the Arabs are the chosen people in the same way the Jews are. That's a different question. And we return to Abram, and God says it's through Isaac that I'm blessing you, not through Ishmael. But for now, I just wanted to show you that. And then let's talk about the encounter with Christ, which in this chapter is Hagar's encounter. So it says, now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to shore. This is the first time that the phrase the angel of the Lord is used like this, I think, at all in the Bible. And it's used here. The very first time the angel of the Lord appears, he appears to Hagar. Now, most people, when they see the angel of the Lord, it seems like, let me talk a little bit about that before we go to this passage. Seems like when people saw the angel of the Lord, it doesn't just mean an angel from the Lord. It means they were actually seeing the Lord somehow. He was revealing himself to them in human form. And they weren't seeing him as a vision or as a dream. They were seeing a person in front of them that they sometimes took to be an angel and sometimes took to be God himself. And the scriptures seem to confirm that it was God himself. So these are very mysterious places because normally speaking, you can't see God. He's invisible. But there are these times in the Old Testament, just a few places, where the angel of the Lord shows up, and it seems to be God himself. Now it says in 1 Timothy, and I just want to show you some verses. A lot of people think that wherever we see this in the Old Testament, it's called a theophany, an appearance of God himself in human form, that means it was Jesus, because Jesus is the one who reveals God in human form. And they point to these verses. 1 Timothy says, he is the blessed and only sovereign, this is talking about God the Father, the King of kings and Lord of lords, who alone possesses immortality and dwells in unapproachable light, whom no man has seen or can see. And then in John 1:18, it says, no one has seen God at any time. The only begotten God who's in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him, or he has revealed him. And then in John 14, Jesus said, have I been so long with you and you've not come to know me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. And so one of Jesus's roles was to show up in a bodily form and show us who the Father is, to show us what God is all about. Jesus, of course, is God, but he's God in a form that we can see and grasp. And so a lot of people think that wherever the angel of the Lord occurs, this is literally an encounter with Christ before he was born in Bethlehem as a baby, but still in bodily form. The angel of the Lord appears later to Abraham in Genesis 22, to Moses, to Balaam, and you can see the list here. I just left it up here if anybody wants to look these up. These are other places throughout the rest of the Old Testament where the angel of the Lord shows up. And in almost every case, you see clear hints that this is actually God himself. Okay. Then I want to look at this verse, which is really, really interesting. And I wish I understood it better, but I'll at least show you a little bit of why I say it's so interesting. Then Hagar called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are a God who sees, she said. Have I even remained alive after seeing him? Therefore, the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. So a lot of people have heard about this. The phrase, the God who sees, is one of the things that we often study when we study the names of God. She says, you're a God who sees. It shows up in Amy Grant's song, El Shaddai, El Shaddai. He says, to the outcast on her knees, that's Hagar, you are the God who really sees. And so the idea here is that Hagar discovered that God noticed her, paid attention to her, really saw who she was. But the interesting thing is when I started looking this up, that's not the only thing it might mean. The literal phrase is, so there's four phrases here. God who sees, have I remained alive after seeing him, and the name of the well. Now the God who sees is the word El Roi, which means so closer to God of seeing. And it could mean the God who sees, but it also could mean the God who is being seen, the God who makes himself seen, who reveals himself to people. And that makes sense in the context because she says, you're a God who is a God of vision, a God of seeing. And for she said, I even remained alive after seeing you. And so it could mean that. It could mean that he's a God who is seen by us, that he reveals himself like the angel of the Lord. Or it could mean the God of seeing, or who sees us, the God who sees us. I suspect it means both. He's the God of seeing. He's the God of revelation. He both sees us and he reveals himself to us to the extent that we are able to handle it. And then this phrase, when it says, have I even remained alive after seeing him? Some translations interpret it as, have I even remained alive after he has seen me? It's the same kind of phrase. It could mean that God is the God who sees or God who has seen, both. And depending on the context is what determines which way it means. And Bir Lahai Roi means the well of the living one of seeing. Again, it could mean the God who sees or the God who is seen. There's sort of an ambiguity here. And even this phrase, have I remained alive, in the Hebrew, it's, have I gone on seeing here? And sometimes that's a phrase that means, am I still alive? I can't believe I'm still seeing the light of day after seeing God. But it could also mean, I am seeing God who's seeing me, or something like that. So it's a very mysterious verse. I looked it up in a bunch of commentaries, and one of them said, this is a very perplexing verse, and nobody's completely sure what it means. But the main idea seems to be that the God of seeing is the God who sees us, really sees us in every respect, and the God who also reveals himself to us so that we see him, even though no man can see God and live. He finds ways to let us see him. He's the God for Hagar who saw everything in her life, understood every bit of her heartbreak, understood what she was going through, and was able to send her back into it because he knew and he understood and he had plans. But he was also the God who revealed himself to her, and she saw the angel of the Lord, and she said, I have seen you and I remain alive. I've seen you and I'm still able to see the light of day. And so the well was the well of the living one whom I see, or the living one who sees me, or both. I think probably both. But this is an amazing encounter with God who tells us that he's a God who sees us and he's a God who lets us see him. So here's the summary. Abram and Sarai again are tempted to help God out with his promise, and this time it leads to a huge mess. Ishmael and his descendants, they're not Israel, but they're still blessed by God from the very beginning. Just like Israel, they depend upon the mercy of God for their very existence as a people. And then Hagar encounters the angel of the Lord and recognizes him as the God of seeing, the one who sees and hears her in her affliction, and also the one who reveals himself to her, and yet she lives. So very interesting passage, I think. I would love to understand it better. Have a good week. See you next week.